Case 1. Jim Jones. On November the 18th, 1978, 918 people died in a remote jungle settlement in the South American nation of Guyana. It remains one of the largest single losses of American civilian life in the 20th century, outside of natural disasters or warfare. The settlement was called Jonestown. The man who built it, who led thousands of people there, and whose decisions preceded those deaths, was a pastor from Indiana named James Warren Jones, the founder and leader of a religious organization called the People's Temple. James Warren Jones was born on May the 13th, 1931, in Crete, Indiana. From a young age, he displayed an intense interest in religion, conducting informal ceremonies as a child and spending significant time studying scripture and theology. By his mid-20s, he had begun building a formal congregation. In the year 1955, he founded what would become the People's Temple in Indianapolis, Indiana. The early years of the organization were built around racial integration and social welfare programs, at a time when both were deeply contested in American public life. Jones drew followers across racial and economic lines, and the congregation grew steadily. In the mid-1960s, Jones relocated the organization to Redwood Valley in Northern California, citing a fear of nuclear war and claiming that California offered a safer environment. By the early 1970s, the People's Temple had established major operations in both San Francisco and Los Angeles. Jones cultivated close personal and political relationships with California elected officials and civic leaders. The organization operated social programs, ran care facilities, and presented itself as a progressive force in the community. Membership climbed into the thousands. Jones was photographed with prominent politicians. The organization's public image was one of genuine community service. But behind the public-facing operations, a very different picture was forming. Former members who left the organization in the 1970s began speaking to journalists and investigators. The accounts they gave were consistent with one another and deeply troubling. They described financial control, with members required to sign over wages, savings, and property to the organization. They described restricted freedom of movement, with members monitored and their correspondence reviewed. They described physical punishment administered within the group to those who broke rules or challenged authority. They described an atmosphere of fear in which raising questions was treated as betrayal. As investigative journalists, most notably a team working for New West magazine in the year 1977, and relatives of members began raising formal and public concerns, Jones accelerated a plan he had been developing for several years, the construction of an agricultural settlement in Guyana, on land leased from the Guyanese government. He called it Jonestown. He presented it to followers as a utopian community, a place where the People's Temple could build a just society free from the racism and persecution he claimed threatened the organization in the United States. Hundreds of members relocated, some willingly, some under conditions that investigators would later document as coercive. By the late 1970s, more than 900 People's Temple members were living in Jonestown. Reports reaching the United States from people who had escaped or been allowed to leave described conditions radically different from what had been promised. Former members and concerned relatives described people unable to leave, passports confiscated, food rationed as a form of control, and regular drills, which Jones called white nights, in which members were told they were about to die. In November of the year 1978, United States Congressman Leo Ryan of California traveled to Jonestown as part of a congressional fact-finding mission. Several of his constituents had relatives inside the settlement and had been raising welfare concerns for months. Congressman Ryan was accompanied by members of his staff, journalists, and relatives of members. They arrived at the settlement on November the 17th. On November the 18th, as Congressman Ryan prepared to depart with a group of People's Temple members who had chosen to leave, the delegation was ambushed at a nearby airstrip in Port Kaituma. Gunmen from the settlement opened fire. Congressman Ryan was killed. 4 others died alongside him, members of the media and a departing member of the temple. He remains the only sitting member of the United States Congress to die in the line of duty in that manner. Hours later, 909 people died at the Jonestown settlement itself. Among those who died were 276 children. Federal investigators, military personnel, and Guyanese authorities spent weeks documenting the site. The FBI assembled one of the most extensive case files in the Bureau's history. Audio recordings recovered from the settlement were entered into the evidentiary and historical record. Jones died from a gunshot wound. He was 47 years old. He never stood trial. Because Jones died that day, there was no prosecution, no defense, and no courtroom verdict. But the investigation did not end with his death. Congressional inquiries produced detailed reports. Government agencies reviewed how the warning signs had been missed. The FBI's Jonestown case files, released in stages over the following decades, run to thousands of pages. Survivor testimony, recovered documents, forensic photographs, and audio recordings form a permanent and extensively studied record of what occurred. The case permanently changed how law enforcement, mental health professionals, and government agencies assess high-control organizations. It produced significant policy discussion about the obligation of government to investigate welfare concerns raised about closed communities. It remains required study in academic courses covering coercive control, organizational psychology, and the ethics of religious freedom versus individual protection. James Warren Jones was never sentenced because he did not survive to face judgment. But the record he left behind, built by investigators, survivors, and the institutions that examined his crimes, is permanent. Case 2. Warren Jeffs. In August of the year 2006, a Nevada state trooper pulled over a red Cadillac Escalade traveling on Interstate 15 near Las Vegas. The driver gave a false name. Inside the vehicle, investigators found wigs, disguises, and more than $50,000 in cash. The passenger in the vehicle was Warren Steed Jeffs, the most wanted religious figure in the United States, listed at that moment on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. The arrest took less than an hour. The prosecution that followed took 5 years, moved across 2 states, and ended with a sentence that guaranteed Jeffs would spend the rest of his life in prison. Warren Steed Jeffs was born on December 3, 1955, in Sacramento, California. He was the son of Rulon Jeffs, the president and prophet of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a religious organization entirely separate from the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which had formally renounced plural marriage in the 19th century. The Floyds maintained the practice and operated in the twin border communities of Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona, communities where the organization held dominant influence over housing, employment, education, and local government. Warren Jeffs grew up inside the Floyds hierarchy, was educated within its institutions, and served as principal of a church school before ascending to a leadership role as his father's health declined. When Rulon Jeffs died in the year 2002, Warren Jeffs assumed the position of president and prophet of the Floyds. Under his leadership, the organization became increasingly centralized around his personal authority. Court records, FBI reports, and the testimony of former members and survivors document what followed. Jeffs claimed the authority to determine who could marry whom, assigning wives, including girls in their early teens, to older men within the organization. He reassigned wives and children between men as punishment or reward. He excommunicated hundreds of male members, effectively removing them from their homes, families, and livelihoods in a single decision. He controlled housing, since nearly all property was held by the church trust, and financial resources, since members were expected to contribute to the organization. His first criminal prosecution took place in Utah, where in September of the year 2007, a jury convicted him as an accomplice to a marriage he had performed between a 14-year-old girl and her 19-year-old cousin. Jeffs was sentenced to 10 years to life in the Utah State Prison. That conviction was later overturned by the Utah Supreme Court in the year 2010 on the specific grounds that the jury had received flawed instructions about the definition of accomplice liability. The court's ruling was narrow. It did not find Jeffs innocent, and by the time the Utah decision came down, the far more significant prosecution was already underway in Texas. In April of the year 2008, Texas Department of Public Safety officers and Child Protective Services personnel conducted a large-scale operation at the Yearning for Zion Ranch, a 4,000-acre FLDS property Jeffs had ordered constructed near El Dorado in Schleicher County, Texas. The operation, prompted by a report of abuse, resulted in the temporary removal of more than 400 children from the property. Most were returned following extended legal proceedings, but the evidence gathered during the operation, physical records, personal journals, photographs, computers, and biological samples, formed the foundation of what would become the Texas prosecution. The forensic work conducted by Texas investigators was meticulous and specific. DNA testing of biological samples established that Jeffs had fathered a child with a 12-year-old girl. Audio recordings recovered from the ranch documented specific events. Handwritten records, which investigators described as detailed and explicit, documented the arrangements Jeffs had personally authorized and performed. Digital evidence from computers seized during the operation was cataloged by forensic technicians and reviewed by prosecutors. The trial took place in San Angelo, Texas, in July and August of the year 2011. Jeffs chose to represent himself for significant portions of the proceedings. At several points during the trial, he delivered extended religious recitations in place of legal argument. The evidence presented by prosecutors included the DNA results, the audio recordings, the written records, and the testimony of investigators who had processed the material. In August of the year 2011, the jury convicted Jeffs on 2 counts: aggravated sexual assault of a child and sexual assault of a child. The victims were 12 and 15 years old. The sentencing phase followed immediately. The jury assessed a sentence of life in prison plus 20 years and a fine of $10,000. Jeffs is held within the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Under Texas law, his parole eligibility date, the earliest date at which he could theoretically be considered, is the year 2038. Jeffs was born in the year 1955. The mathematics of his age, sentence, and eligibility date make release during any foreseeable time frame impossible. In the years since his conviction, media reports and former member accounts have described Jeffs continuing to issue directives to FLDS followers from his prison facility, leading to ongoing monitoring of his communications. Case 3. Tony Alamo. On November the 13th of the year 2009, a federal judge in the Western District of Arkansas sentenced Tony Alamo to 175 years in federal prison. Alamo was 74 years old. He had been convicted 4 months earlier on 10 federal counts. He entered the federal prison system and he never left it. He died in the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, in May of the year 2017. He was 82 years old. He had served approximately 8 years of a sentence that had been designed, by its length, to ensure he would never be free. Tony Alamo was born Bernie Lazar Hoffman on September the 20th, 1934, in Joplin, Missouri. He changed his name as an adult and built a public persona as a preacher and entrepreneur. In the 1960s, together with his wife Susan Alamo, he began street ministry work in Hollywood, California. The couple operated a free restaurant and distributed religious literature, drawing followers from communities including people experiencing homelessness and individuals in addiction recovery. The organization grew, incorporated as Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, and by the 1970s operated businesses, farms, and residential communities across multiple states. Alamo-branded clothing became recognizable nationally. Susan Alamo died in the year 1978. Tony Alamo refused to accept her death and, according to court records and former member testimony, kept her body at the ministry's property for a period before she was eventually buried. The event marked a turning point in the ministry's internal culture. Under Tony Alamo's sole leadership, the organization became progressively more controlled and isolated. The center of operations eventually shifted to Fouke, Arkansas, where the ministry operated a large compound. Former members who left the organization in the 1980s and 1990s gave accounts that were documented by journalists and eventually by law enforcement. They described an organization in which Alamo exercised control over every aspect of followers' daily lives: their schedules, their relationships, their financial resources, and their children's upbringing. Members worked in ministry businesses and were not paid standard wages. access to outside information was restricted. Children in the organization were educated internally. Concerns about the treatment of children were raised publicly over a period of years. In the year 1991, state authorities in Arkansas conducted an inquiry into the ministry, and some children were temporarily removed, though they were later returned. The concerns did not go away. Journalists continued to investigate. Former members continued to give testimony. The documentation accumulated. In September of the year 2008, federal agents from the FBI executed a search warrant at the Fouke compound. Several days later, Alamo was arrested in Flagstaff, Arizona. The federal charges centered on violations of the Mann Act, the federal statute formerly known as the White Slave Traffic Act, which criminalizes the transportation of minors across state lines for unlawful purposes. The prosecution was built on the testimony of victims. Multiple young women, all of whom had been children at the time of the offenses, testified before the federal jury in Texarkana, Arkansas. Their accounts described what had occurred when they were as young as 8 years old. Prosecutors supported the victim testimony with travel records, financial records, and corroborating physical and documentary evidence. The 10 counts on which Alamo was convicted involved 5 named victims. The jury convicted Alamo on all 10 counts on July the 24th of the year 2009. The sentencing, conducted on November the 13th of the year 2009, produced the 175-year term. Alamo addressed the court before sentencing, maintaining his innocence and framing his prosecution as religious persecution. Alamo appealed. The Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed the conviction and the sentence and upheld both. The civil consequences followed the criminal ones. In the year 2013, a federal civil jury in Texarkana awarded 7 former followers a total of $30 million in damages against Alamo and his ministry's assets, comprising both compensatory damages for the harm they had suffered and punitive damages assessed against the organization. Alamo continued to issue statements to followers from prison through the ministry's communication channels. He never acknowledged wrongdoing and maintained until his death that he had been wrongly prosecuted. He died in federal custody on May the 2nd of the year 2017. His 175-year sentence had been designed to outlast him, and it did. Case 4. Roch Thériault. In the year 1993, a man named Roch Thériault stood before a Canadian court and entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. In the years that followed, Thériault appeared before the Parole Board of Canada and asked to be released. The board reviewed the evidence. The board reviewed his record. The board said no. He applied again. The board said no again. He never left prison. On February the 26th of the year 2011, Thériault died inside Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick. He was 63 years old. He had spent nearly 2 decades behind bars and had never, at any point, been given his freedom. Roch Thériault was born on May 16, 1947, in the Lac-Saint-Jean region of Quebec. He had limited formal education and no religious credentials, but in the late 1970s, he began constructing a belief system of his own, a mixture of apocalyptic prophecy, personal revelation, and authority claims that positioned him as a divinely appointed leader. He drew a small group of followers, most of them young adults seeking meaning and community, and began organizing communal life around his teachings. The group that formed around Thériault eventually settled on a remote rural property near Burnt River in Ontario. They called themselves the Ant Hill Kids, a name that reflected the communal labor structure Thériault imposed. The group cleared land, built structures, grew food, and operated in substantial isolation from the surrounding community. Children were born within the commune and raised entirely inside it. Court records and the testimony of survivors, gathered both before and after Thériault's conviction, document what life inside the commune was like. Thériault held absolute authority. He determined who lived where, who worked at what task, and who was subjected to discipline. He fathered children with multiple women in the group. Punishment for perceived disobedience or failure was administered physically, at his direction or by his hand. Medical care was not obtained from outside practitioners. Thériault performed procedures himself without medical training. The death that formed the foundation of the murder charge was that of a woman named Solange Boilard, a member of the commune who died in the year 1989. Following her death, members of the commune began to leave, and some of those who left made contact with law enforcement. The accounts they gave initiated a formal investigation. Physical evidence was gathered, and the testimony of survivors was documented. The cumulative picture that emerged allowed prosecutors to bring a murder charge against Thériault. His guilty plea to second-degree murder in the year 1993 resolved the central criminal charge. The life sentence imposed under Canadian law came with a parole ineligibility period of 10 years, the mandatory minimum for second-degree murder under the Criminal Code of Canada. Thériault became eligible to apply for parole after serving those 10 years. But eligibility and release are not the same thing. The Parole Board of Canada, in successive hearings, reviewed Thériault's case and determined that he continued to pose an unacceptable risk to public safety. His applications were denied. In February of the year 2011, Thériault was killed inside Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick. His cellmate, Matthew Gerald MacDonald, was responsible. MacDonald admitted to the killing, which was reported in detail by CBC News. Thériault died in custody. He had never been free. The survivors of the Ant Hill Kids commune bore the lasting effects of their years inside it. Several spoke publicly in the years after their departure, and their accounts were documented in books and journalistic investigations that remain part of the permanent record of the case. Their courage in speaking, both to investigators and to the public, ensured that the full scope of what Thériault had done was understood. Case 5. Colin Batley. In March of the year 2011, a jury at Swansea Crown Court in South Wales returned verdicts on a case unlike almost anything the Welsh courts had previously encountered. The defendant was a man named Colin Batley. The jury found him guilty on 35 counts. The judge imposed an indeterminate sentence of imprisonment for public protection and ordered that Batley serve a minimum of 11 years before he could even apply for release. Under that form of sentence, release is not automatic at the minimum term. It depends on a parole board making a positive determination that the prisoner no longer poses a risk to the public. No such determination has been made in Batley's case. Colin Batley lived in the small Welsh town of Kidwelly, in Carmarthenshire, in a modest residential property on an ordinary street. From the outside, his household appeared unremarkable, the kind of setting no outside observer would give a second thought. Inside, according to the investigation and the evidence presented at trial, Batley had constructed an elaborate framework of control over a small group of followers. He used the writings of Aleister Crowley, the early 20th century British occultist, as the theological and philosophical foundation for that framework. He positioned himself as the group's leader and authority, and he used that position to facilitate serious and sustained sexual abuse of multiple victims, including children. The group operated in secrecy over a prolonged period. Members were drawn into the household's activities gradually, and the isolation and internal dynamics of the group made disclosure difficult. Several co-defendants, including Batley's wife, Elaine Batley, and 2 other women associated with the group, were also involved in the offending. The case came to light when one of the victims found the courage to report what had happened. That disclosure, made to police, initiated a formal investigation by South Wales Police. Detectives approached the inquiry methodically, first interviewing the initial complainant in detail, then identifying and approaching other potential victims, and gradually building a complete picture of how the group had operated and what had occurred within it. The consistency of victim accounts across multiple interviews, conducted independently and without prior coordination between the witnesses, was a significant factor in the strength of the prosecution's case. The evidence gathered by detectives included victim testimony, corroborating accounts from witnesses, and material gathered during searches. The 35 counts on which Batley was convicted at trial included rape and indecent assault committed against multiple victims. His co-defendants were also convicted at trial on related counts and received custodial sentences. The trial judge, His Honor Judge Paul Thomas, addressed Batley at sentencing and described the case as among the most serious he had encountered during his time on the bench. He imposed the indeterminate sentence specifically because he concluded that Batley posed a continuing danger to the public that a fixed-term sentence could not adequately address. BBC News covered the trial and verdict in detail. The case received significant attention across the United Kingdom. Batley remains in custody. The indeterminate nature of his sentence means that each time the question of his release is considered, the parole board must be satisfied not merely that he has served time, but that he no longer poses a risk. Given the nature and volume of his offending and the framework of control he constructed, that is a high threshold. He has not cleared it. The victims in this case, who included children abused over years, gave testimony that formed the core of the prosecution. Their willingness to come forward, beginning with the single disclosure that opened the investigation, made every subsequent conviction possible. Case 6. Arthur Schirmer. In July of the year 2008, Arthur Schirmer called emergency services and reported that his wife, Betty Jean Schirmer, had been injured in an automobile collision. First responders arrived at the scene on a road in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, and found Betty Schirmer critically injured. She was transported to hospital and died from her injuries. The initial investigation recorded the incident as a traffic accident. Arthur Schirmer was a United Methodist pastor. He was the kind of figure, long-serving, community-rooted, professionally credentialed, who was not automatically placed under scrutiny. The case was closed. Or so it appeared. Arthur Schirmer had been ordained as a United Methodist minister and had served congregations in Pennsylvania for decades. His ministry included a congregation in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and at the time of his second wife's death, he was serving a church in Readers, in Monroe County. He was a visible and respected figure in the church community, known to his congregants as a devoted pastor. What reopened the case had nothing to do with Betty Schirmer at first. In the autumn of the year 2008, a man died by suicide inside the office of Schirmer's Readers Church. Pennsylvania State Police Corporal Daniel Gillette was assigned to investigate that incident. In the course of his work, Gillette became aware of Betty Schirmer's death months earlier, and something in the record prompted him to look more closely. His decision to examine a case that had already been closed was the single most important moment in the entire investigation. Gillette and the investigators he worked with applied accident reconstruction forensic analysis to the reported collision. This methodology uses the physical evidence of a crash, vehicle deformation, tire marks, debris patterns, and injury patterns to reconstruct what actually occurred. The analysis compared the damage to the vehicle, the conditions at the scene, and Betty Schirmer's injuries against the low-speed collision Schirmer had described. The conclusion the forensic analysts reached was unambiguous. Her injuries were not consistent with the collision he had reported. Blood pattern evidence recovered from the scene was also inconsistent with his account of events. The investigation did not stop with Betty Schirmer. Detectives turned their attention to Schirmer's first wife, Jewel Schirmer, who had died in the year 1999. Her death had been recorded at the time as the result of a fall down a staircase at the couple's home in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. With the scrutiny now being applied to Arthur Schirmer's history, investigators re-examined the circumstances of that death as well. The review of the 1999 case produced findings that the original investigation had not made. Schirmer was arrested and charged. In the year 2013, a Monroe County jury convicted him of first-degree murder in the death of Betty Jean Schirmer. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Separate proceedings in Lebanon County related to the death of Jewel Schirmer produced an additional conviction. The combined legal outcome ensured that Arthur Schirmer would die in the Pennsylvania state prison system. Schirmer appealed his conviction, arguing legal errors in the proceedings. The appellate courts reviewed the matter, and the conviction was upheld. His case was profiled on NBC's Dateline in an episode that traced the investigation from the original accident report through the forensic reconstruction and the role Corporal Gillette played in reopening the inquiry. ABC's 2020 produced a similar profile. Both programs focused on the forensic methodology that had revealed the inconsistencies no one had caught the first time around. The case stands as a study in forensic accident reconstruction and in the importance of investigators who are willing to look at a closed case from a fresh angle. 2 women died. One recorded death had already been filed as an accident and a fall. It was the work of a single attentive investigator, triggered by an entirely separate incident, that ensured Arthur Schirmer would face a jury. He is serving life without parole. He will die in prison. Case 7. Marcus Wesson. On March the 12th of the year 2004, police officers in Fresno, California, responded to a disturbance call at a residence on Hammond Avenue. When they entered the home, they found 9 people dead. The victims ranged in age from young children to young adults. Every one of them was a member of Marcus Wesson's family. Wesson himself walked out of the home, covered in blood, and was taken into custody without resistance. He was 57 years old. In the year 2005, a Fresno jury convicted him of 9 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. He remains on death row in the California state prison system today. Marcus Wesson was not an ordained minister of any recognized denomination. He had no formal religious credentials and no institutional affiliation. What he had was an authority he constructed himself, a personal theological system drawn from a distorted interpretation of biblical texts, augmented with references to vampirism and other elements he wove into his own doctrine. He used that constructed system to position himself as the patriarch, prophet, and ultimate authority over an extended family that, over the course of decades, he kept isolated from the outside world. The family had been highly mobile for years, living at various points on boats moored at marinas in California, and in other settings that made sustained outside contact difficult. Wesson controlled the household's finances, imposed rules about contact with outsiders, and determined every significant aspect of how the family lived. Former family members and survivors, who testified during the investigation and trial, described an environment in which questioning his authority was not permitted, and in which his decisions on all matters were treated as final. The events of March the 12th occurred when family members who had managed to leave the household in earlier years returned to the Hammond Avenue residence to attempt to recover children they believed were being held there against their will. A confrontation took place outside the home. Police were called. Wesson retreated inside. Minutes later, the 9 victims were dead. The investigation that followed was extensive and methodical. Forensic teams processed the scene over a period of days. DNA analysis was applied to establish the precise biological relationships among the 9 victims, between the victims and Wesson, and between the victims and other family members. The analysis confirmed relationships at the center of additional charges Wesson faced beyond the murder counts. Digital evidence and physical records were cataloged. The scene itself was documented in exhaustive forensic detail. Survivor testimony was central to the prosecution's case at trial. Family members who had not been present on March the 12th and others who had left the household at various points in earlier years gave accounts of how Wesson had structured life inside the family. Their testimony described what he had demanded, what he had done, and how he had enforced his authority. Prosecution and defense arguments were presented over the course of a lengthy trial in Fresno. The jury's verdict came in the year 2005. 9 counts of first-degree murder. Multiple additional felony convictions. The penalty phase produced a death sentence. Wesson remains on California's death row. California carried out its last execution on January the 17th of the year 2006. Governor Gavin Newsom issued an executive moratorium on executions on March the 13th of the year 2019, suspending all executions for the duration of his time in office. The moratorium does not commute Wesson's sentence. He remains under a sentence of death, but it means no execution can be carried out while the moratorium is in effect. Regardless of that legal complexity, the practical reality is unchanged. Marcus Wesson has been incarcerated since March the 12th of the year 2004. He will not be released. Case 8. Brian David Mitchell. On June the 5th of the year 2002, at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was taken from her bedroom in her family's home on Christensen Drive in Salt Lake City, Utah. Her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine, was sharing the room and witnessed the event. She waited until she believed it was safe, then woke her parents. Elizabeth Smart was gone. Law enforcement was called. A search began. It would last 9 months. The disappearance became one of the most widely followed missing person cases in recent American history. Elizabeth Smart's family held press conferences and public appeals. Her image was distributed nationally. The FBI joined the investigation alongside local and state law enforcement. Tips came in from across the country. For the first months, every lead was pursued. None produced her. The man responsible was Brian David Mitchell, who was 49 years old at the time of the abduction. Mitchell had, over the preceding years, adopted the identity of a self-styled religious prophet, taking on a biblical name and producing a lengthy handwritten religious text in which he claimed divine appointment and outlined a doctrine built around his own authority and desires. He had spent time doing odd jobs in Salt Lake City, including repair work at the Smart family home, which he had performed approximately 9 months before the abduction. He was accompanied by his wife, Wanda Barzee, who participated in the captivity. After taking Elizabeth Smart from her home, Mitchell and Barzee held her captive across multiple locations in Utah and California. Mitchell used his claimed religious identity as a framework within which he imposed control over his captive. He conducted a ceremony he described as a marriage and cited his religious writings as authorization for his actions. The case broke on March the 12th of the year 2003, 9 months after the abduction. 2 citizens in Sandy, a suburb of Salt Lake City, were walking when they observed Mitchell, Barzee, and a third individual whose appearance struck them as unusual. They recognized details from the composite image of Mitchell that had been distributed publicly, including in a segment on the television program America's Most Wanted that had aired in the preceding weeks. They contacted police. Officers arrived and made contact with the group. The third individual was Elizabeth Smart. She was recovered alive and returned to her family within hours of the citizens' call. The recovery of Elizabeth Smart was followed by the arrest of both Mitchell and Barzee. The prosecution that followed was significantly delayed by extensive legal proceedings to determine whether Mitchell was mentally competent to stand trial. Evaluations were conducted, experts disagreed, hearings were held, and appeals were filed. The competency litigation continued for years, and the federal case did not reach trial until the year 2010 in Salt Lake City, in the United States District Court for the District of Utah. The trial produced a detailed and documented record of the abduction, the captivity, and the evidence gathered by investigators. Witnesses who had encountered Mitchell and Barzee during the 9 months of Elizabeth Smart's captivity testified. Mitchell's own religious writings were entered into evidence and read to the jury. Perhaps most significantly, Elizabeth Smart herself took the stand and testified about her captivity in a manner that prosecutors, defense attorneys, and courtroom observers all noted for its composure, detail, and consistency with the physical and documentary record. In December of the year 2010, the federal jury convicted Brian David Mitchell on 2 counts: kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines. On May the 25th of the year 2011, the federal judge sentenced Mitchell to 2 consecutive life terms in federal prison. He is held in the federal prison system and he will not be released. Wanda Barzee entered a guilty plea and was sentenced separately. She was released in September of the year 2018 after the Utah Board of Pardons determined that her sentence, including time served, had been completed. Her release was publicly opposed by Elizabeth Smart, law enforcement officials, and victim advocates who argued that the board had failed to account for the full severity of her role. Elizabeth Smart went on to found the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, dedicated to child protection and survivor advocacy. She has testified before legislative bodies, spoken internationally, and become one of the most recognized advocates for missing persons and survivors in the United States. Her decision to testify at trial and to speak publicly about her experience is widely credited with contributing to policy changes in how missing person cases involving minors are handled. The case that began on June the 5th of the year 2002 ended formally with 2 consecutive life sentences. Brian David Mitchell will die in federal custody. 8 men, 8 communities, several countries, several courtrooms, several decades, different crimes, different sentences, different investigative methods, and different forensic breakthroughs. But one outcome applied to every single man you have heard about in this program: they will not walk free. What the collective weight of these case files makes clear is that trust is the most powerful asset a position of authority carries, and that when that trust is abused, the concealment can last for years, sometimes decades, before investigators and survivors find a way through. What breaks these cases open is almost always the same combination of factors: a survivor with the courage to speak, an investigator willing to look past an easy explanation, a forensic method sophisticated enough to reveal what the physical record actually shows, and a legal system with enough evidentiary foundation to bring a conviction. The records documented in this episode exist permanently. They live in court archives, FBI case files, parole board transcripts, forensic reports, and the testimony of people who chose not to stay silent. That permanence matters. These cases do not disappear. The people who were harmed are not forgotten. And the men who are serving their sentences in the facilities named in these records are not going anywhere. Thank you for watching The Crime Whisperer. If this kind of careful, methodical, fact-based documentary work is what brings you here, then help this channel grow. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss a case. Turn on notifications, and stay with us. I am The Crime Whisperer. I will see you in the next one.